Okay? There's another group of economists who argue for very strong regulation, right? That we should provide either explicitly or implicitly guarantee of deposits as we do, and that we should also regulate banking portfolios relatively carefully. The interesting thing, I think, is that all economists on both sides of that divide agree on one thing. And the one thing that they agree on is that the one thing you can't have is partial deregulation. What you cannot do is you cannot either, you can't make banks too big to fail and be willing for the federal government to bail them out, or explicitly guarantee their deposits through federal insurance, and not regulate their portfolios. So you constantly have lobbyists coming to Congress saying, oh, we want deregulation. And what do they mean by deregulation? They mean you guarantee the results, and we get to invest in whatever risky things we want to invest in. Okay? And that is total insanity. Okay? Better to have complete regulation than that kind of deregulation. Better maybe even to have complete deregulation. But the middle is worse than either extreme. And Milton Friedman is a man who recognized those kinds of subtle policy distinctions. Right? And if he were today, I suspect he would probably not be arguing we should abolish the Fed, we should go to total deregulation. Not because he would think that that's not the right thing to do, but because he would view it as politically infeasible and understand that within the realm of choices that are probably relevant today, the total regulation one is probably the only one that we're likely to see, and that the intermediate one is just catastrophic. I want to say one other word about the financial crisis as well on Milton Friedman. Chile in 1981 had a financial crisis. People think of this as something very unique, our financial crisis. It's not at all. Economists have studied dozens of these all around the world. There was one in Chile in 1981, very similar to what we're facing today, that was resolved very successfully. Okay. By whom? By Milton Friedman's students, the Chicago boys in Chile. And by the way, what they did is they did the opposite of what we did. They didn't bail out the big banks. They failed the banks. They made them go bankrupt. Okay. They took them over. Nationalization, by the way. You think that would be a dirty word for somebody like Milton Friedman or students? No, they nationalized the banks because they had failed. Just as in any bankruptcy proceeding, right? There has to be a legal proceeding for recycling the firm, and then sold it back to the private sector, and it worked extraordinarily well. And it's really unfortunate that the lobbyists for our banks have succeeded in preventing us from doing something like that. All right, so at any rate, that's Milton Friedman. We have a speaker today, Kevin Chavous. I just want to say, I'm not supposed to introduce him, but I'm just going to say two things. One, of course, is that Milton Friedman was a tireless advocate of competition education, recognized the importance of education. And I'm going to listen to Kevin with special interest because he has been very involved with the schools in Washington, D.C., as I understand it. Well, I actually happen to be a product of the public schools in Washington, D.C. So I have enormous admiration for a man who is willing to tackle that particular difficult project.
Thank you, David. You know, I wasn't as lucky as you because I did get drafted and was stationed in Fort Riley, Kansas. Now, most of you don't know this. I'm going to give you a little history lesson. And the purpose of Fort Riley, its mission, is to protect eastern United States from Indian attacks. And the whole time I was there was not a single Indian attack. So I expect all of you to show me a bit more respect going forward. Now, I think most of you are familiar with the tremendous advances in effort in school choice by our today's guest speaker. I have for long respected his work and shared his passion for education reform. You have at your places complete bios, but I just want to tell you a few things about my good friend Kevin Chavous. He's a noted attorney, author, and national school reform leader. He's a former member of the Council of the District of Columbia and the chair of the Council's Education Committee. Mr. Chavous was at the forefront of promoting change within the district's public school system. His efforts led to over $500 million new dollars being made available to educate children in D.C. and one of the most successful complete school choice programs. Since leaving the council, Mr. Chavous has emerged as one of the nation's most respected and courageous and influential education reform leaders. He's a distinguished fellow with the Center for Education Reform and serves on the board of the Black Alliance for Education Options. More recently, Mr. Chavous served as a member of the Education Policy Committee of the Obama presidential campaign. Please welcome my good friend, Kevin Chavous.
I do have some prepared remarks, but I was sitting next to Rex, and he fired me up, so I'm just going to say what I feel. I mean, it was almost like a communist conspiracy or something. I feel like he just wanted to get me going. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with Show Me Institute, and I'm a big fan of Show Me's work, and I know several of the board members here, Kevin and Beavis and Rex, and I'm very proud to be affiliated with the work that you do. It is noteworthy for me to be here on the anniversary of Dr. Friedman's birth. I was in Kansas City last year, so some of you may have heard me in Kansas City, and as I said to many of you who were there last year, I'm going to watch to see and make sure you don't fall asleep as I say some of the same things. I am going to refer to one thing that Dr. Friedman, and I want to make sure I get the quote right. The professor was talking about how Dr. Friedman was such an advocate for freedom in this country. And in his landmark book, where the idea of parental school choice and vouchers were birthed, the legendary paper, 1955 paper, The Role of Government in Education, he wrote, and I quote, "We have reached the conclusion that government financing of primary and secondary schooling is entirely consistent with private administration of schooling, and that such a combination is both more equitable and more efficient than the existing linkage of financing with administration." In shorthand, what he is saying is that we need to make sure that that combination exists in terms of private administration of schooling and the public administration of schooling. And the danger is that if you rely on just the government administration of schooling, it can be catastrophic. And you know, what's interesting is a funny thing happened on the way to that enlightenment that Dr. Friedman wrote of in 1955. Over the next 20 to 30 years, we saw just what he predicted would happen, in fact, happen. The monopolistic approach of having government run our school system, particularly in the K through 12 arena, led to disastrous results. The morphing of bureaucracy through administration, special interests, union rules, all of these things that had little to do with the advancement of educating the American population, all of these things led to disastrous results. So much so that while today's focus is understandably on the plight of our urban school districts, the deep, dark, dirty secret is all of our educational outputs in the K through 12 arena are sliding. And among the world standings, where we regularly be in the top 3 among the industrialized nations in the world in terms of our educational outputs for children, in the last study we were 25th. We have countries that just got a whiff of freedom within the last 15 years in Eastern Europe who are far surpassing us in our educational outputs because they understand the notion of individualized attention to the student. They understand the idea of parental choice. They understand the idea of making sure that they have a system that serves children as opposed to a system where the children and the public serves the system. And I think it's more than noteworthy that the parental choice movement, which was in fact birthed by Dr. Friedman's 1955 paper, has now created an environment where the notion of choice will be the salvation for education in this country. I can be pretty strident. I'm the first to admit that. And usually when I speak with folks about the state of public education, because I think to understand is, as I like to say, to understand where we need to go, we need to understand where we've been. And the other thing we need to do, we need to be brutally honest about where we are.